Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 deeply unsettling stories from people who ventured into the deep woods, those remote, isolated places where cell service disappears, where trails end, and where you're truly alone with whatever else is out there. These aren't campfire tales designed to scare teenagers. These are real experiences from real people who went into the wilderness seeking solitude and adventure, only to encounter something that changed how they see the natural world forever. Before we dive in, I want to know, have you ever been truly alone in the wilderness? Miles from civilization, no phone signal, no other people for miles? There's something both liberating and terrifying about that level of isolation. Drop a comment and share your experiences. Because what you're about to hear will make you question whether being alone in the woods is ever really safe, or if you're ever truly alone out there at all. Alright, let's begin. And remember, every word of these stories is true. Story 1, The Cabin That Burns. This is one of those stories I've been sitting on for a really long time. It happened back when I was maybe 25 or 26, way before I met my wife and way before we had kids. I was a completely different person back then, not in a bad way, just in the sense that I had the kind of free time and risk tolerance that I genuinely can't relate to anymore. I used to do these solo backpacking trips a few times a year, usually somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd drive out to some remote trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, way off the main trail, and spend a few days completely off the grid. No cell service, no other people, nothing. I loved it. The solitude, the challenge, the feeling of being completely self-reliant. My friends thought I was insane for going alone, and honestly, they were probably right. But that was part of the appeal. This particular trip was in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, and it changed how I see solo backpacking forever. I'd been out there for 2 days, and everything had been going perfectly. The weather had been ideal, clear skies, moderate temperatures, minimal bugs. The trails were quiet, and I hadn't seen another person since the first morning. That changed pretty quickly on the afternoon of the second day. I noticed dark storm clouds building up to the west. At first, I wasn't too worried. I'd hiked through rain plenty of times before, and it was never a big deal. Just throw on the rain gear and keep moving. But within about an hour, I realized this wasn't going to be a passing shower. The wind picked up hard enough that I could hear it roaring through the canopy above me. The temperature dropped fast enough that I actually stopped to put on another layer. By the time the rain started, I was already looking for a place to hunker down and wait it out. The problem was that I was in a pretty exposed section of trail. No natural shelters, no rock overhangs, nothing that would provide decent protection. And as I'd predicted, it wasn't a light rain. Within minutes, it went from windy to full-on downpour. The wind was bending smaller trees sideways, and I could hear branches cracking and falling in the canopy above me. I started getting genuinely concerned about my safety. Lightning was striking close by, close enough that I could smell the ozone in the air, and I was hiking at elevation with a metal frame pack on my back. Not ideal. I kept pushing forward, completely soaked at that point, scanning the woods on either side of the trail for anything that could pass as shelter. And then, as if by some miracle, I actually saw something. Through the trees off to my left, maybe 50 yards from the trail, there was a structure. It was small and dark and partially hidden by the forest, but it was unmistakably man-made. As I got closer, I realized it was a tiny one-story cabin. It looked extremely old, like it could have been a hunting cabin or a homesteader's shelter from decades ago, maybe even longer. There was a single window on the side I was approaching, and a door that looked like it was barely hanging on its hinges. I can't overstate how relieved I was. I practically sprinted over to it, my boots squelching in the mud, and pushed the door open without hesitation. Inside, it was dim but dry. There wasn't much in there, just a wooden chair, a small table against one wall, and what looked like an old cot frame pushed against the far wall. There was a stone fireplace on the right side that was clogged with ash and debris. The place smelled bad, musty and damp, with an underlying odor I couldn't quite identify. But I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of my soaked clothes and get warm. I dropped my pack, stripped out of my wet layers, and literally just picked a spot on the floor and lay down. I was in pure survival mode at that point, not exploration mode, not curiosity mode. All I cared about was that I was out of the storm. It wasn't until I'd been inside for maybe 10 or 15 minutes that I started actually looking around. With the storm raging outside, there wasn't much else to do. I clicked on my flashlight and started examining the cabin more closely. There was more stuff in there than I'd initially realized. For starters, there was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't look ancient like everything else in the cabin. It was newer, maybe a few years old at most. That confused me. If the cabin was abandoned, why would there be a relatively new sleeping bag in here? There were also a couple of cans of food and water jugs on the table. That made me think someone had been using the place as a base camp, maybe another backpacker or a hunter. It wasn't unusual to find stuff like that in remote cabins. People leave supplies, use them as emergency shelters, that kind of thing. But the more I looked around, the more things started bothering me. There were marks on the wall near the door. At first, I thought they were just damage from age or weather, water stains, wood rot, that kind of thing. But when I got closer and shined my flashlight directly on them, I could see they were scratches. Not just a few scratches. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. They were clustered together in certain areas, some shallow and some deeper, carved into the wood with what must have been fingernails or something sharp. There was no pattern to them that I could see. They weren't tallies or words or any kind of organized marking. They were just desperate. That's the only word I can think of. They looked desperate. I stepped back and examined the door itself. The handle was a simple wooden latch, nothing unusual about that. But despite the storm, I decided to open the door and get a look at the mechanism from the outside. That's when I saw it. There was a metal bracket on the outside of the door frame, the kind designed to hold a padlock. And it was positioned in such a way that the lock would only secure the door from the outside. There was no corresponding latch on the inside. No way to lock the door from within the cabin. That meant this door could only be locked from the outside. Someone inside couldn't secure themselves in for safety. But someone outside could trap someone inside. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. I shut the door and turned back to examine the cabin more carefully. The only thing I hadn't checked yet was the window. I walked over to it slowly, that feeling of unease growing with every step. The glass was still perfectly intact, which surprised me given how old everything else appeared. But then I noticed why. There were screws drilled into the window frame, one in each corner, securing it shut from the outside. Someone had deliberately sealed this window closed. And it had been done from outside the cabin. Around the edges of the frame on the inside, there were more scratches. Deep ones this time, unmistakable. They looked like someone had tried to pry the window open with their bare hands, clawing at the wood until their fingers bled. All of it hit me at once like a physical blow. Someone had been kept in this cabin. Held against their will. Trapped. The sleeping bag, the food, the water, those weren't supplies left by a helpful hiker. They were evidence that someone had been living here. Not by choice, but because they had no other option. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that cabin immediately. But I hesitated. Part of me felt like whatever had happened here was well in the past. Everything looked old and abandoned. Even the sleeping bag, which seemed newer than the rest, was stiff and dusty. Plus, the storm was still raging outside. The rain was hammering the roof so hard it sounded like a drum. Lightning was cracking every few seconds. The thought of going back out there into that chaos was almost more terrifying than staying in this disturbing cabin. So I stayed. I tried to rationalize it. Tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. This was just an old cabin with some weird history, nothing more. I'm not sure how much time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The storm wasn't letting up at all. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. That's probably why it took me so long to notice the other sound. Underneath the roar of the rain, there was a scratching or scraping sound coming from outside. It was faint at first. I thought it might just be a branch scraping against the exterior wall. But I couldn't remember seeing any branches low enough to touch the cabin when I'd approached it earlier. Then I heard two heavy thuds on the porch. They were distinct, deliberate, not the random impacts of storm debris. I stood up immediately, my heart starting to pound. I did that thing where you freeze in place and stare at a random spot on the wall, trying to focus all your attention on listening. I was trying to hear over the storm, but if someone was moving out there, it would have been nearly impossible to detect. I started getting paranoid that I'd already missed sounds, that maybe someone had been circling the cabin for a while and I just hadn't noticed over the noise of the rain. My eyes drifted to the window. I couldn't bring myself to look through it. If someone was really out there, they'd probably be looking in. And if I looked out, I'd see them staring back at me. I stayed frozen in that position for what felt like forever, every muscle in my body tense. After a while, I started to relax slightly. Maybe I had just been hearing the storm. Or at worst, an animal poking around the cabin looking for shelter. I was almost ready to write it off and try to get some rest when I heard something that sent me over the edge. Pressure on the door. Like someone was leaning their full weight against it from the other side. The wood creaked loudly. The latch rattled once, testing it, before the pressure released. My heart rate shot through the roof. And that's when something clicked in my head. A realization that made my blood run cold. Why would someone be outside in a storm like this, circling the cabin, testing the door, without just coming inside? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was stopping them from walking right in. Unless they didn't want to come inside. Unless the whole point was to keep me inside. The cabin, the scratches, the locks on the outside, this wasn't just some abandoned shelter. This was a trap. And I'd walked right into it. I don't know if that was the right conclusion or if my mind was just spiraling into paranoia. But I decided right then that I was leaving. Immediately. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I'd rather take my chances with lightning and rain than stay in this cabin one more second. I started shoving things into my backpack as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the zippers. I had this overwhelming feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That I'd stayed too long, that I'd made a fatal mistake by not leaving earlier. And I was right. The next few moments happened in a blur. I was maybe 30 seconds from walking out the door when I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me. I spun around just in time to see something crash through the window, a bottle, a jar, I couldn't tell what, and the entire room erupted in flames. The fire spread so impossibly fast that I couldn't even process what was happening. 1 second, I was standing in a dark cabin. The next second, the walls were engulfed in flames. The heat hit me like a physical wall, searing my exposed skin. I could smell my hair singeing. I lunged for the door and grabbed the handle. It wouldn't budge. Someone had jammed it from the outside. They'd waited until I was distracted, then sealed me in. I slammed into the door with all my weight. Once. Twice. 3 times. On the 4th impact, it gave. The wood splintered and the door collapsed off its hinges, taking me with it. I hit the muddy ground hard but scrambled to my feet immediately. I couldn't see anything, smoke and rain and darkness all mixed together into chaos. I just ran. Wildly, blindly, crashing through the underbrush, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that burning cabin. Before I could get far enough away, something hit me from behind. Hard. I went down face first in the mud, and suddenly there was a person on top of me. We were fighting. Actual fighting, clawing, kicking, screaming. I couldn't see their face. Everything was happening too fast. They were trying to get me in a chokehold, gouging at my eyes, pulling my hair. I could feel myself getting dizzy, my vision starting to narrow. But I managed to buck them off. I don't know how, pure adrenaline, probably. I shoved them hard and scrambled to my feet. I kept running. Behind me, I could hear them screaming. Not words, just this animal shrieking that didn't sound human. I looked back twice as I ran. The first time, I couldn't see my attacker, but I could see the cabin. It was fully engulfed in flames, a massive fireball that lit up the forest around it. The image of that inferno is burned into my brain forever. The sight of it, the roar of the flames, the smell of burning wood and accelerant. The second time I looked back, the glow was smaller but still visible through the trees. And I could still hear that awful screaming somewhere behind me. I didn't stop running until my legs literally gave out. I found a spot where a couple of large trees had fallen against each other, creating a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled under there and collapsed. I couldn't feel my body. I don't know if it was shock from the fire, exhaustion from running, or the cold rain that had soaked me to the bone. Maybe all three. But I was completely numb. I just sat there in that cramped space, trying to keep breathing, trying to process what had just happened. I don't know how many hours I spent under those trees. Time lost all meaning. Eventually, feeling started to return to my limbs, painful, burning sensation as circulation came back. I knew I had to move. Whoever had tried to kill me was probably still out there, and they couldn't have been far away. So I forced myself to get up and start moving through the woods. I didn't know where the trail was anymore, but I didn't really care. I just needed to get away from that area. I honestly can't tell you how I survived that night. But I did. I stumbled onto a trail, I don't even know if it was the same one I'd been on before, and just followed it. I was soaked, probably bleeding from multiple places, covered in mud and ash, but I kept walking. Eventually, the rain subsided enough for me to get my bearings. I made it to a trailhead sometime the next afternoon, not the one where I'd parked, but a different one miles away. The first person I saw drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck. The doctors told me I was lucky I hadn't inhaled more smoke. They said if I'd been in that cabin even 30 seconds longer, I probably wouldn't have made it out. None of the damage was permanent, but it hurt like hell for weeks afterward. By the time I was healed and back home, I'd made a decision. I would never do solo camping trips again. Ever. Someone had intentionally set that cabin on fire to kill me. That's the only explanation that makes sense. It was pouring rain, a full-blown thunderstorm. The roof was metal. There's no way a wooden structure goes up that fast, that completely, unless the wood had been treated with accelerant beforehand. Someone had prepared that cabin as a trap. They'd coated it with something flammable, waited for someone to take shelter inside during the storm, then lit it on fire. And whoever it was had been prepared for me to escape. They'd been waiting outside to finish the job. I gave the police everything I could, approximate location, description of the cabin, details about the attack. But I could tell they weren't going to do much. I hadn't been in a designated camping area, so pinpointing the exact location was nearly impossible. Plus, without a body or hard evidence, there wasn't much to investigate. The only thing I still don't understand is the timing. Why did they wait so long? I was in that cabin for over an hour before they made their move. They could have set it on fire the moment I walked in. Were they watching me the whole time? Waiting for something specific? Or did they have to go get the accelerant and come back? I'll never know. My wife would probably tell you I stopped doing solo trips because I grew up and got more responsible. And she's not entirely wrong. But I've never told her about this incident. I've never told anyone the full story until now. I don't go into the deep woods anymore. Not alone. Not ever. Because somewhere out there, someone is still using cabins like that one as traps. Still waiting for lost hikers to seek shelter during storms. Still setting fires and attacking anyone who tries to escape. And I got lucky enough to survive. Story 2, The Lookout Tower. My name is James. This happened maybe 7 or 8 years ago, back when I was in my early 20s and still doing stuff that I probably shouldn't have been doing. I had this friend, Charles, who was kind of notorious in our friend group for finding cool places to explore, abandoned buildings, old factories, decommissioned military sites. If it was somewhere you weren't supposed to be, Charles had probably already been there and could tell you exactly how to get in. He spent a weird amount of time on Google Earth and these niche urban exploration forums. He'd always be hitting the group chat with screenshots of random places he wanted to check out. Most of our friends would entertain his ideas but never actually follow through. I was usually the exception. Charles and I had been friends since high school, and I think the reason we got along so well was that we had similar thresholds for risk. While most of our friends would hear his pitches and go, "That sounds insane," I'd hear them and go, "When are we going?" It was a dynamic that led to some great memories, and a few situations that I look back on now and genuinely wonder how we made it out unscathed. This story is about one of those situations. One weekend, Charles texted me about a fire lookout tower he'd found deep in some national forest. I really wish I could remember which forest, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, I think, but the details are fuzzy. Charles said it had been decommissioned years ago and was just sitting out there in the middle of nowhere, completely untouched and unsecured. He was convinced we could hike out to it, climb it, and spend the night up there. The idea of being 70 feet up in the middle of a forest with a 360-degree view sounded incredible to me. We picked a random weekend and made it happen. Charles planned the entire thing, the drive, what to pack, how to find the tower once we were in the woods. It was about a 3-hour drive. Charles told me the hike would be off-trail but pretty short, about 4 miles. We drove out early on a Friday morning and made it into the woods sometime in the early afternoon. I was honestly expecting us to get lost or not find the tower at all. But we did find it, and seeing it through the trees for the first time was insane. I remember blurting out, "No way," when I saw how tall it was. The structure was even more impressive up close. The cab at the top was a small square room with windows on all 4 sides. A metal staircase zigzagged up the frame, with a section of vertical ladder for the final stretch up to the cab. The whole thing looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Some of the lower railings were bent or missing, and there was graffiti on the support beams near the base. To be completely honest, it did not look structurally sound. But Charles was practically giddy. While I was hesitating and debating whether to try convincing him to back out, he'd already started climbing. I yelled at him to be careful, which got him to slow down slightly. Then I figured, what the hell, and started climbing after him. We made our way up slowly, checking each step as we went. Most of them felt solid enough, but there were definitely spots where the bolts had rusted through and the steps wobbled dangerously. The vertical ladder section near the top was the sketchiest part. It was about 20 feet of straight climbing with nothing but a narrow metal cage around it. One slip and you'd fall all the way to the ground. But we made it up without any issues, and the view from the top was unreal. You could see for miles in every direction, endless forest broken up by occasional ridgelines and distant mountains. We'd timed it perfectly. The sun was maybe an hour from setting. Our plan was simple: camp up there for the night, watch the sunset, stargaze, and catch the sunrise in the morning. There was a decent wraparound walkway up there, which is where we decided to hang out initially. We cracked a few beers and just enjoyed the view and conversation. The sun eventually went down, and the sky went from orange to purple to dark blue to complete darkness in what felt like minutes. Once the light was gone, the forest below us was just a black void in every direction. There wasn't a single light visible anywhere, no towns, no houses, no cars. Just absolute darkness. The stars were incredible, easily the best I've ever seen. No light pollution whatsoever. But being up there in the dark was starting to freak me out a little. It was weird not being able to see anything despite knowing there was a whole forest below us. Charles could tell I was getting antsy, so he started messing with me, grabbing my shoulder suddenly, making creepy noises, that kind of thing. But the thing that actually pissed me off was when he smacked his metal water bottle against the side of the tower. It sent this incredibly loud, echoing clang in every direction. The sound rang out across the forest, probably audible for miles. It was so loud and ominous that I actually got mad at him. I told him to knock it off and that I wanted to go inside the cab. He finally got the hint. He said he'd finish his beer first and then join me inside. I went into the cab and started setting up my sleeping stuff. But before I could finish, Charles called my name in a very quiet, serious voice that was completely unlike him. I walked back outside to where he was sitting. He was pointing diagonally downward toward the forest below. At first, I thought he was messing with me again. But it only took me a few seconds to realize what he was pointing at. There was a light down there. It was faint and pretty far away, but it was definitely there, a single point of light weaving through the forest at what looked like walking pace. It was genuinely horrifying. My first thought was that it was someone who'd heard the clang from the tower and was coming to investigate. I whispered, I don't know why I felt the need to whisper, "You're stupid for doing that. We're probably about to get caught or arrested." Charles looked at me with this confused expression. "You think that's a person?" I was confused now too. What else would it be? "That light is moving way too evenly," he said. He wasn't wrong. The light wasn't swinging or bobbing the way you'd expect from someone carrying a flashlight or lantern. It was moving perfectly smoothly, like it was floating. But it was also far away, too far to tell for sure. Neither of us said anything after that. We just watched the light as it continued weaving through the forest, getting slowly but steadily closer. After a few minutes, it became obvious that the light was heading directly toward the tower. And the weird, perfectly smooth movement became more apparent the closer it got. "What do we do?" Charles finally asked. I didn't have an answer. What could we do? Climb down? We'd be completely exposed on those stairs, and if someone was waiting at the bottom when we reached it, we'd be trapped. As we were throwing out theories, the light suddenly zipped forward. It wasn't a gradual acceleration. For a split second, that light went from steady, even movement to an abrupt forward leap of maybe 30 feet. Then it was back to steady movement like nothing had happened. I felt my palms start to sweat. Charles was really freaked out too. I kept trying to convince myself that whoever was down there was just wandering aimlessly and would pass by the tower. But the light kept coming directly toward us. After about 10 minutes, it reached the base of the tower. The light stopped moving and stayed in that exact spot, directly below us. From our position straight above, we could see the light itself but not whoever or whatever was holding it. Charles and I stared at it for a while. The suspense was killing me. Then Charles, because he apparently has a death wish, yelled down at the light, "Hey! Are you okay down there?" I looked at him in absolute horror. I couldn't believe he'd just announced our presence like that. We didn't get a response. The light didn't even move. We waited, and then Charles yelled again. Still nothing. The light just sat there, motionless. There we were, 70 feet up in an abandoned fire tower in the middle of nowhere with something blocking our only exit. We were completely trapped. We must have watched that light for 30 minutes straight, whispering to each other occasionally. It never moved once. Finally, I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it straight down at the base of the tower. But even with my light shining directly on the spot, I still couldn't see the source. I could see the stairs, the support beams, the ground, but no person, no lantern, nothing that could be producing that light. Eventually, we accepted that there was nothing we could do and tried to get back to normal. We went back to talking, but I never took my eyes off that light for more than a few seconds. Charles started suggesting it was some kind of lead that someone had placed there to mess with us. But who would do that? And how would they have known we'd be there? At some point, Charles said he was going to climb down and check it out. I told him that was absolutely insane. Not only was it inviting trouble, but it was dangerous to climb down in the dark. While we were arguing about it, I glanced down and realized I couldn't see the light anymore. It was gone. Just darkness below us again. I frantically scanned the void below, looking for any sign of it, but there was nothing. Charles seemed relieved. He kept telling me to relax, saying whoever had been there had probably left. But I was the opposite of relieved. The thought that someone, or something, could be down there and we couldn't see them anymore was terrifying. Charles tried to reassure me that we'd obviously hear if anyone tried to climb the ladder. I guess that was true, but I was still deeply unsettled. I suggested we wait out the rest of the night inside the cab. Charles agreed. We went inside and set up our sleeping bags. Neither of us had any intention of actually sleeping. That would be suicide. Staying awake turned out to be the right decision. Not 20 minutes after going inside, we started hearing noises. The first ones were metallic clangs that echoed up through the steel frame of the tower. They weren't footsteps. I want to be crystal clear about that. I was listening specifically for the sound of someone climbing the stairs. This was different. It sounded like someone striking one of the support beams with a wrench or crowbar. A few minutes later, another sound came. This one was more of a grinding sound, like metal being twisted against metal. It lasted several seconds before stopping. Charles and I kept looking at each other like we were expecting the other one to do something. But there was nothing we could do except wait. The sounds kept coming from what seemed like different spots around the tower. Whatever was making them was moving down there. I kept trying to map out the sounds in my head, figure out where they were coming from, whether they were getting closer, whether there was more than one source. I couldn't make sense of any of it. Charles and I were whispering to each other about what we'd do if someone started climbing up. I was sitting against the far wall of the cab, facing the windows on the opposite side. Charles was across from me, looking over my shoulder. There were windows on all four walls, so we were trying to keep an eye on all of them. There wasn't much to see, though. They were all dark, with only the stars and moon providing any light. But then I saw something that made my heart stop. A dark outline moved across one of the window panes. It was quick, just a shape passing by, but I definitely saw it. Before I could process it, the shape passed in front of the next window over. Someone was outside. On the walkway. Circling the cab. I couldn't help but yell, and Charles scrambled away from the window near him. We both immediately ran to the door and pressed our backs against it. If someone tried to come through, they'd have to push through both of us. I kept looking at the windows, trying to spot the figure again. But I couldn't see anything. It was gone. But that was impossible. Unless they were crawling on all fours or had climbed over the railing, I should have been able to see them through at least one of the windows. Charles and I sat pressed against that door for hours. I could hear him hyperventilating. My own breathing was rapid and shallow. By the time the sun started coming up, I was completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. When it was finally light enough to see clearly, I counted to 3 and then swung the door open violently, expecting someone to be crouching behind it waiting for us. No one was there. Charles and I ran around the walkway to check all sides. Clear. I looked down at the base of the tower. Nothing down there either. We grabbed our stuff and started descending as fast as we dared, not caring about being careful anymore. We just wanted to get down. We made it about 3/4 of the way when Charles stopped suddenly in front of me on one of the landings. He just stood there, staring down at the next section of stairs. I looked past him and saw it immediately. An entire section of the staircase was gone. Not just a few steps. I'm talking about a whole section, maybe 10 or 12 steps, completely missing. Just a gap in the staircase with nothing but open air. It was impossible. But we were staring at it. Someone had removed an entire section of stairs during the night while we were sitting directly above them. That must have been what those sounds were. But it didn't make sense. The noises hadn't been loud enough or long enough for someone to disassemble that many stairs. And they would have had to unbolt them from the frame, which would have made a tremendous amount of noise. Plus, there's no way someone could have done that work and then made it up to the walkway where I'd seen them at the window. You can't cross a gap like that in the dark. And yet here we were, staring at a missing section of staircase. We stood on that landing for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, we realized we had no choice but to jump. It wasn't that far, maybe 5 feet, but it was still scary, especially looking down at the ground so far below. Charles went first and twisted his ankle on the landing. I made it across without injury. We made it the rest of the way down and didn't look back. There was no one waiting for us at the bottom. No sign of where the missing stairs had gone. We didn't stick around to investigate. We just started hiking back the way we'd come. I still don't have an explanation for any of it. Not the light that moved too smoothly. Not the sounds. Not the figure I saw at the windows. And definitely not how someone managed to remove an entire section of steel staircase in the middle of the night without us hearing it. Every time I see Charles, which is less often now that we're older and he's moved away, this is something we still talk about. Neither of us has ever been back. And neither of us ever will. Story 3, The Trees That Fall. I go camping alone a few times a year. I've been doing it since I was in my 20s, and at this point I'm in my late 30s, so we're talking close to 15 years of solo trips. I know the risks, which is why I always carry a rifle, a .308 bolt action that I've owned since I was 22. I'm not a paranoid person, but being alone in the wilderness requires certain precautions. This happened about 2 years ago in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. It's a massive stretch of wilderness, over 700,000 acres. And if you know where to go, you can hike for days without seeing another person. I'd had a rough stretch at work. My head wasn't in a great place, and I felt like I just needed a few days away from everything. Away from people, away from my phone, away from responsibilities. I drove out on a Thursday morning. I parked at a trailhead off a Forest Service road and started hiking. The plan was simple, 3 nights in the backcountry. That was it. I had my tent, my pack, enough food and water for 4 days, and my rifle. The first day was exactly what I needed. I covered about 7 miles before finding a flat spot near a creek bed that looked perfect for camping. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and had a fire going by the time the sun started going down. I cooked some food, drank a beer, and sat by the fire until it burned down to embers. The whole time, I didn't see a single person. Perfect. I fell asleep around 10 p.m. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me. It was more like my brain just switched on for no reason, the way it sometimes does when you're sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. I lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling of my tent. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something strange. There was a faint orange glow coming through the walls of my tent. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Maybe 200 yards away through the trees, there was a fire. Not a big one, about the size of a campfire, but it was definitely there, flickering in the darkness. I watched it for a few minutes, waiting to hear voices or see movement. I wanted to confirm it wasn't some random forest fire that I needed to worry about. But after watching for a while, I couldn't hear anything beyond the crackling of flames. I couldn't see any silhouettes of people or tents. I figured it was probably another camper who'd set up nearby that I just hadn't noticed during the day. It wasn't impossible, especially since I'd gone to sleep relatively early. I assumed whoever it was had gone to sleep and left their fire burning, which is irresponsible and dangerous, but not uncommon among inexperienced campers. I watched it for about 5 more minutes to make sure it wasn't spreading, then zipped my tent back up and went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the fire was the first thing I thought about. Not because it had scared me, but because I was curious. I wanted to see who else was out there. Maybe say hi. I packed up my campsite and hiked in the direction where the fire had been. It took me about 10 minutes to reach the area. I was pretty confident I had the right spot. There was a natural clearing that lined up with the angle I'd been looking from. But when I got there, I stopped in my tracks. There was no fire pit. No ring of stones. No pile of ash or scorched ground. No charred wood. Nothing. The ground was completely undisturbed. Pristine. Like no one had set foot there in months, maybe years. I walked the entire clearing, checking for any sign that someone had been there. There was nothing. I stood there for a while, genuinely confused. I was certain I'd seen a fire. I'd watched it burn for at least 5 minutes. There was no doubt in my mind. And yet the ground where it should have been looked untouched. I considered the possibility that I had the wrong spot. But there wasn't another clearing anywhere near the right distance or direction. There wasn't much I could do beyond that, so I just moved on. I still had 2 more nights planned, and I wasn't about to cut my trip short over something I couldn't explain. I hiked for most of the day. The terrain changed as I moved deeper into the forest. The creek bed fell away behind me and the ground started climbing. By mid-afternoon, I was in a denser, older section where the trees were massive and the canopy blocked out most of the sky. It was quieter in there, which I liked. Peaceful. I found a good campsite around 4 p.m. and set up for the night. The evening was uneventful. I doused my fire a little after 9 o'clock and turned in. I don't know what time it was when the sound woke me up, but it was loud enough to pull me out of a deep sleep. It was this distant, enormous cracking sound, like a thick branch being snapped in half, except it kept going. It was violent and continuous, and it lasted for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. At the tail end of it, there was a deep, resonant thud that I could literally feel through the ground beneath my sleeping bag. I knew instantly what it was. A tree had fallen somewhere deeper in the woods. A big one. If you've ever heard a tree fall, and I understand that's a rare experience for most people, it's both amazing and terrifying. The sheer force and scale of it is hard to describe. It didn't scare me exactly, but it gave me this massive adrenaline rush. My heart was suddenly pounding, and I was wide awake. I lay there trying to figure out what could have caused it. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. It wasn't storming. There was barely any wind. The weather conditions were perfect. There was no obvious reason for a tree to suddenly come down on a night like this. But there was also nothing I could do about it. I was miles from civilization, alone in my tent. So I just lay there, waiting for the adrenaline to wear off so I could fall back asleep. But then, not 10 minutes later, it happened again. Only this time, it was much louder. That same gruesome crackling sound, followed by a crash of branches and leaves, and then the deafening thud that shook the ground. But this one was close. Not right on top of me, but close enough that the sound was almost disorienting. And it came from a completely different direction than the first one. The first tree had fallen somewhere to the south of my campsite. The second one was to my northwest. I sat up immediately, my sleeping bag falling away. Now I was actually scared. 2 trees falling on the same night, in 2 different parts of the forest, with no wind and no storm? That was beyond coincidence. That was impossible. I kept trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe the first tree falling had caused some kind of chain reaction. Maybe its roots had been connected to other trees, pulling them down with it. But that didn't account for the fact that the trees had fallen in completely different areas. They were too far apart for one to have affected the other. These were 2 separate events. 2 independent tree failures happening within minutes of each other. That was even more impossible than the first scenario. I was sitting there processing all this, my mind racing, when I heard something new. Something that took my fear from a manageable level to absolute terror. It was a low, continuous rumbling sound. I can only describe it as a cross between a groan and a growl, like someone clearing their throat, except it didn't stop. It just kept going and going. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. And I've heard a lot of animals in the woods over the years. I've heard bears grunting and huffing. I've heard elk bugling. I've heard bobcats screaming in the night, which sounds disturbingly like a woman screaming. This wasn't any of those. This was something else. Something I'd never heard before. And it sounded deliberate. Like something was making the noise on purpose, not as a warning or communication, but just because. The sound went on for what felt like a full minute without any break or variation in pitch or volume. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around as quietly as I could, and aimed it at the tent flap. At that point, I was in full panic mode. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the rifle steady. The rumbling sound eventually faded. It didn't stop abruptly, it just got quieter and quieter, like whatever was making it was moving away from my campsite. And then the forest was quiet again. The normal quiet of a forest at night. No wind, no animal sounds, just stillness. But I didn't find it peaceful anymore. It felt oppressive. Like something was out there in that silence, waiting. I sat like that for at least 20 minutes, rifle aimed at the tent entrance, barely breathing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I physically couldn't. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I'd hear some tiny sound, a branch creaking, leaves rustling, and I'd snap back to full alertness. It was the worst night of my life. As soon as I saw the first hint of daylight filtering through the tent walls, I got out. I didn't even wait for proper sunrise, just that first gray pre-dawn light was enough. I packed up as quickly as possible, hands still shaking from lack of sleep and residual fear. Once everything was in my pack, I stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just hightail it back to the trailhead and get the hell out of there. But another part, the part that needed answers, that couldn't live with the mystery, knew I had to investigate. I needed to see the second tree. The one that had fallen close by. I needed confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I started walking in the direction where I thought the sound had come from, rifle in my hands, safety off, finger near the trigger. I found the tree after about 10 minutes of searching. It was massive. The trunk had to be at least 4 feet in diameter at the base. It was lying at an angle across a shallow slope, with broken branches and debris scattered everywhere. So it was real. I hadn't imagined it. I actually felt a weird sense of relief seeing it, at least I wasn't losing my mind. But then I started examining the tree more closely, trying to understand what had caused it to fall. I walked over to the stump, which was about 3 feet high. The wood where it had broken was pale and fresh, you could still smell the sharp, clean scent of exposed timber. But the break wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind of jagged, splintered fracture you get from wind stress or the tree's own weight causing a failure. The wood around the break point had been torn apart. Ripped. Parts of the stump looked like they'd been gouged out. There were long, irregular grooves running through the wood at different angles. Some of them were easily an inch deep, cutting through the solid heartwood like it was soft cheese. The wood looked like it had been stripped and chewed rather than broken or cut. I'd seen beaver damage before. This wasn't that. Beavers leave clean, almost surgical cuts made by their constantly growing incisors. Their work is recognizable, neat channels and chips. I'd seen woodpecker damage too. Also not that. Woodpeckers create holes and divots looking for insects, but they are small scale and precise. This was aggressive, messy, and covered way too much surface area to be any animal I could think of. The tree hadn't fallen because it was dead or diseased. It hadn't been knocked over by wind. Something had actively worked on that trunk until it came down. I examined more of the stump. Some of the bark around the base had been peeled away in long strips, revealing the pale wood underneath. And that exposed wood had the same gouged, chewed appearance as the break itself. Whatever had done this had spent considerable time and effort on it. This wasn't opportunistic feeding or marking territory. This was deliberate destruction. And as I stood there looking at the damage, a thought occurred to me that made my stomach drop. If something could do this to a tree with a 4-foot diameter trunk of solid hardwood, what could it do to a person? I needed to leave. Right now. I started backing away from the tree, my eyes scanning the surrounding forest, looking for any sign of movement. But as I was turning to head back to where I'd left my pack, something near the base of one of the fallen branches caught my eye. There was a small cluster of items sitting on the ground, partially hidden by broken branches and leaves. If they hadn't looked man-made, I wouldn't have noticed them at all. But they were clearly out of place. I moved closer, dread building with every step. It was a blue bandana and a carabiner. My blue bandana. My carabiner. I instantly grabbed my pack off my shoulders and dug through the outside pocket where I kept miscellaneous gear. They were gone. Both items were missing. My hands started shaking again. These items had been in my pack last night when I went to sleep. They'd been zipped inside a secure pocket. And now they were here. At the base of a tree that something had destroyed during the night. Which meant whatever was out here had been in my campsite while I was sleeping. Had gone through my pack. Had taken items from inside it. And had left them here for me to find. I didn't wait to see if there was anything else. I didn't try to rationalize or investigate further. I just grabbed my pack, shoved the bandana and carabiner back inside, and ran. I didn't jog or walk quickly. I ran full out, branches whipping my face, my pack bouncing painfully against my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I don't know if running was the right decision. Maybe it attracted attention, made me more visible, marked me as prey. But I didn't care. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from that area as fast as possible. I got tired after a while, couldn't maintain that pace under the weight of my gear. But I moved as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, gripping my rifle so tightly my knuckles were white. The hike back took most of the day. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched. Followed. Like something was pacing me through the trees, staying just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. I kept my rifle ready the entire time. If anything came at me, bear, mountain lion, person, whatever the hell had been in my camp, I was going to shoot first and ask questions never. I made it back to my car around 3 p.m. The parking area at the trailhead looked like paradise, civilization, safety, a way out. I threw my gear in the trunk, got in the car, locked all the doors, and just sat there shaking for several minutes before I could even put the key in the ignition. Then I drove. Fast. I drove until I was out of the forest, back on paved roads, back in areas where there were other people and houses and cell phone signal. The first thing I did when I had service was call the police. I told them everything, the trees falling, the sounds, the items taken from my pack and left at the scene. I don't think they took me very seriously. The officer I spoke to said they'd make a note of it and increase patrols in the area, but I could tell he thought I was either crazy or exaggerating. And to be fair, I wasn't even sure exactly where I'd been. I'd gone off trail, hadn't marked my route with GPS. I couldn't give them coordinates or a specific location to investigate. So I knew there probably wasn't much they could do, even if they believed me. I was pretty messed up for days afterward. I had nightmares about those sounds, the trees cracking and falling, that awful rumbling growl that went on and on. None of it made sense. What I couldn't get over was the fact that my stuff had been taken from my pack. That something had been in my campsite while I was sleeping, close enough to touch me, and I hadn't known. That unexplained fire from the first night must have been connected somehow. It had to be. There's no way that was a coincidence. And those trees, I still have no explanation for what could have brought them down like that. The damage looked almost like they'd been chewed through, but what animal has the jaw strength to do that to solid hardwood? I genuinely don't think it was anything human. A person with tools could have cut down a tree, sure. But not that quickly, not that quietly, and not while leaving that specific pattern of damage. As for what animal it could have been, I have absolutely no idea. I still go camping, believe it or not. My wife thinks I'm crazy for continuing after what happened. But the woods are part of who I am, I can't just give them up entirely. But I don't go alone anymore. Ever. And I don't go to Daniel Boone National Forest. Whatever is out there in those woods, whatever took down those trees, whatever made that sound, whatever went through my pack in the middle of the night, it's still there. And I have no intention of ever meeting it face to face. 3 people. 3 trips into the deep woods. 3 encounters with something that defied explanation. I want to thank everyone who shared their stories. The wilderness is beautiful and awe-inspiring, but it's also home to things we don't understand, things that might not want us there. If you found these stories compelling, please like and subscribe. And if you have your own unexplained experience from the wilderness, drop it in the comments. These stories deserve to be heard. Stay safe out there. Never go alone. Trust your instincts. And remember, just because you can't see anything doesn't mean you're alone. Until next time.